Open Book: The Crime Story, Coordinated Prisoner Resistance. Chapter 1, The State's Response. The sound of untouched meal trays echoed louder than any riot. On July 1, 2011, Pelican Bay's SHU erupted in silence. A silence that carried across California's prison system. Men starved themselves not as an act of despair, but as an act of defiance. For the first time in decades, the world was forced to look inside the concrete tombs of California's most notorious Supermax. At first, the state brushed it off. Denial and downplaying. The California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation (CDCR) had seen disruptions before. In the early days of the 2011 strike, officials dismissed it as a minor protest, a handful of inmates refusing food to cause trouble. Publicly, they reassured reporters that order was being maintained and that the strike was not widespread. Behind the walls, though, reality looked different. By the end of the first week, more than 6,000 inmates across 13 prisons had joined the protest. By 2013, when the second strike exploded, over 30,000 inmates across 33 facilities were refusing food. The state could no longer pretend this was just noise inside the SHU. It was a coordinated act of resistance, the largest prisoner protest in California history. The physical toll inside. Prison officials couldn't hide the medical reports. Inmates were collapsing in their cells. Men who weighed 180 pounds dropped to 140 in weeks. Some were rushed to infirmaries with failing kidneys and dangerously low blood pressure. Medical staff documented cases of fainting, dizziness, and organ strain. By the third week, some prisoners had gone without food for over 20 days. By the sixth week of the 2013 strike, hundreds had starved themselves nearly to death. At least one man, Billy Guero, died during the 2013 protest. The CDCR claimed it was suicide, but fellow inmates and advocates insisted his death was the strike's first casualty. His passing drew headlines, sparking outrage and suspicion that the state was downplaying the cost of the protest. Shifting the narrative, blame the gangs. Faced with mounting pressure, the CDCR shifted strategy. If they couldn't deny the strike, they would discredit it. Officials framed the hunger strike as a power play by gang shot callers, an attempt to manipulate the system under the guise of human rights. They argued that leaders of groups like the Mexican Mafia, Aryan Brotherhood, Black Guerrilla Family, and Nuestra Familia were coercing weaker inmates to join the strike. To the public, CDCR painted the image of dangerous criminals using starvation as leverage. To inmates and their families, it was a smear campaign, a way to delegitimize their desperate plea against indefinite solitary confinement. Human rights groups step in. But the state's narrative didn't hold for long. As the strike spread, outside voices amplified what prisoners had been saying all along. The ACLU, Amnesty International, and other advocacy groups condemned the SHU system as a form of psychological torture. Reports described how men were locked away for 10, 20, even 30 years with no clear path out. Families told stories of sons and fathers who hadn't touched another human being in decades. Amnesty International issued a statement. California's use of prolonged solitary confinement at Pelican Bay is cruel, inhuman, and degrading. It amounts to indefinite torture. The contrast was stark. The state insisted the strike was gang manipulation. Human rights groups called it survival. The public eye turns to Pelican Bay. For years, Pelican Bay's SHU had been hidden from public view. Few people knew what went on inside those windowless cells. The hunger strike ripped that veil away. News outlets ran front-page stories about men starving themselves in protest. Documentaries and interviews exposed the conditions inside the SHU. Families marched on the Capitol in Sacramento, carrying photos of loved ones locked in isolation. The strike became not just a prison story, but a national conversation about mass incarceration, human rights, and the ethics of solitary confinement. Political pressure mounts. As media coverage grew, politicians were forced to respond. Legislators called hearings to investigate SHU policies. Lawmakers questioned whether California's approach to gang management was sustainable or humane. Governor Jerry Brown, under pressure, defended the system at first. He insisted solitary confinement was necessary to protect staff and inmates from gang violence. But the longer the strike lasted, the harder it became to hold that line. By the end of the 2013 protest, California's prison system stood at a crossroads. The state could no longer deny the strike's reach. It could no longer dismiss the human toll. And it could no longer hide the fact that indefinite solitary had become one of the darkest stains on American justice. By September 2013, after 60 days without food, the strike ended. Hundreds had been hospitalized. Families were traumatized. The state had been forced to admit the truth. California's SHU system was not just controversial, it was unsustainable. But the story didn't end with the strike. It would take years of lawsuits, court battles, and relentless pressure from advocates before the system finally cracked in 2015. Coordinated prisoner resistance. The aftermath. When the 2013 hunger strike ended after 60 days, California's prisons were left shaken. It had been the largest coordinated prisoner protest in U.S. history, tens of thousands of men starving themselves, one dead, hundreds hospitalized, and international outrage mounting. The strike might have ended, but its echo lingered. For years, the SHU at Pelican Bay had been a secret kept behind layers of concrete and razor wire. Now it was a front-page story, a courtroom battle, and a political crisis. The aftermath would unfold slowly, grinding through legal briefs, family testimonies, and public debate. And in the end, it would dismantle a system that had stood for decades. The legal war begins. Even before the 2013 strike, a lawsuit had been filed on behalf of long-term SHU inmates. Ashker versus Governor of California. Named after lead plaintiff Todd Ashker, a Pelican Bay prisoner who had spent decades in solitary, the lawsuit argued that indefinite isolation violated the Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. The hunger strikes gave the lawsuit momentum. With the world now watching, judges could no longer treat the SHU as an invisible issue. Lawyers for the plaintiffs described conditions in the SHU. Men living in 8 by 10-foot cells 22 to 24 hours a day for decades. No phone calls. No contact visits. No educational or rehabilitation programs. Only isolation year after year with no end date. Some prisoners had been in solitary for over 20 years, placed there not for crimes they committed behind bars, but for suspected gang affiliation. The lawsuit claimed this wasn't just punishment, it was torture. The state's defense. California's lawyers pushed back hard. They argued the SHU was essential to control the state's most dangerous gang leaders. Without isolation, officials said, the Mexican Mafia, Aryan Brotherhood, Black Guerrilla Family, and Nuestra Familia would orchestrate violence both inside and outside prison walls. To them, solitary confinement wasn't cruelty, it was a tool of survival. But the hunger strikes had exposed cracks in that argument. If isolation was meant to silence gang leaders, how had they organized the largest prisoner protest in U.S. history from inside the SHU? The very act of the hunger strikes undermined the state's defense. Families joined the fight. Outside the courtroom, families became the strike's most powerful advocates. Mothers, fathers, wives, and children spoke at rallies and hearings, describing how loved ones had wasted away in solitary. One mother said of her son, who had spent 16 years in the SHU, "He hasn't hugged me since the 90s. His children grew up without him, and now he's a stranger to his own family. That's not justice. That's torture." Another wife testified that her husband had begun hallucinating voices and shadows after years in isolation. "He told me sometimes he hears whispers that aren't there. That's what the SHU does to people. It takes their minds before it takes their bodies." Their words humanized the men behind the steel doors, shifting public perception. Media and advocacy pressure. The hunger strikes had already drawn the attention of major outlets like the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, and CNN. But advocacy groups like the ACLU and Amnesty International kept the pressure alive. Reports called California's SHU a modern dungeon, and likened Pelican Bay to international black sites. Amnesty declared, "No other U.S. state has held so many men in prolonged isolation for so long." The drumbeat grew too loud for politicians to ignore. The turning point, 2015 settlement. In September 2015, California reached a landmark settlement in Ashker versus Governor of California. The terms reshaped the state's prison system. Indefinite solitary confinement was abolished. Inmates could no longer be placed in the SHU solely for gang affiliation. Solitary would only be used for specific, proven acts of misconduct. Thousands of inmates were reviewed for release back into general population units. For many, it was the first time in decades they would see sunlight without steel grates, touch another human being, or walk across open ground. One former SHU prisoner said after the settlement, "When they let me out, I felt the wind on my face. I cried like a child. I thought I'd never feel that again. A new beginning, or a new risk." The settlement was celebrated as a human rights victory. Civil rights lawyers hailed it as proof that resistance, even inside concrete cages, could change the system. Families rejoiced as loved ones were moved into general population units. But inside the Department of Corrections, anxiety grew. Many of the men released from the SHU were high-ranking gang leaders. Officials worried they would use their newfound access to rebuild networks, recruit soldiers, and spread violence. The paradox was stark. The hunger strikes had ended indefinite solitary confinement, but in doing so, they had returned some of California's most powerful gang leaders to the prison yards. The prison yards after the SHU. The years following the settlement saw a shift in California's prisons. Violence did spike in some facilities. Stabbings, assaults, and coordinated gang activity resurfaced in certain yards. Contraband cell phones multiplied, giving inmates new tools to organize. Investigators confirmed that leaders once buried in the SHU were back in circulation, giving orders face to face. Yet for many others, the move out of solitary was a lifeline. Men who had been locked away for decades were finally able to attend classes, work prison jobs, and reconnect with families. Some even earned degrees behind bars. The aftermath was messy, complicated, and full of contradictions. Legacy of the hunger strikes. By the late 2010s, Pelican Bay's SHU no longer resembled the fortress it once was. Rows of windowless cells once filled with men destined to die in silence now stood largely empty. The hunger strikes had written themselves into history. 2011, 6,000 inmates protest across 13 prisons. 2013, 30,000 inmates strike across 33 facilities. 2015, California ends indefinite solitary confinement. It was a story of unity among enemies, of sacrifice, of men who risked death to be seen as human. But it was also a story of power. The strikes proved that gangs, even in isolation, could still control narratives, mobilize thousands, and bend the system to their will. The aftermath of the hunger strikes left California transformed. Pelican Bay was no longer a hidden tomb for the worst of the worst. It was a symbol, a reminder that even inside the most secure prison, silence could become resistance. Yet the shadow of the SHU remains. Every time violence erupts in California's prisons, critics point to the settlement and ask, did ending indefinite solitary save lives, or unleash chaos? The answer lies in the paradox the hunger strikes revealed. Power never disappears behind prison walls. It adapts, it waits, and sometimes, it starves itself into history. Shadows beyond the SHU. When the Ashker versus Governor of California settlement was announced in 2015, cheers erupted outside courtrooms, in advocacy circles, and in family homes across the state. The Security Housing Unit, SHU, at Pelican Bay, long condemned as one of the harshest solitary confinement programs in the world, was no longer the same dungeon it had been for decades. For the first time in years, men walked out of their concrete tombs and into general population yards. The hunger strikes of 2011 and 2013 had forced California to do the unthinkable, end indefinite solitary confinement. But what came next was far from simple. The release into general population. Between 2015 and 2017, thousands of inmates once housed in Pelican Bay's SHU were transferred into general population units across California's prison system. For some, the adjustment was overwhelming. Imagine being locked in a windowless cell for 20 years, then suddenly standing in a crowded yard, the sun burning your eyes, dozens of men shouting, laughing, fighting all at once. For many, freedom from isolation felt like sensory overload. Some prisoners stumbled socially, unable to hold conversations or trust others after decades of silence. Others threw themselves into education programs, prison jobs, or simply the joy of making phone calls without restriction. Families reunited with men who had aged decades in solitude. One former SHU inmate described his first steps into general population. The grass, the sky, even the noise, it hit me like a wave. For a second I wanted to run back into the cell. That's how much the SHU rewired me. The guard's perspective. For correctional officers, the shift was terrifying. Men they had spent careers keeping buried in solitary were now free to mingle. Violence rose in some facilities. Fights broke out as old rivalries resurfaced. Contraband smuggling increased. With gang leaders back in the mix, phones, drugs, and weapons circulated more widely. Orders flowed more easily. Investigators noted that prison gangs quickly re-established lines of communication between leaders and street-level associates. To guards, the reforms felt like giving wolves access to the sheep. One officer put it bluntly. You don't put generals back on the battlefield and expect peace. The family's perspective. For families, the aftermath was bittersweet but mostly joyous. Mothers touched sons for the first time in decades. Fathers hugged children they hadn't seen since they were toddlers. Wives sat across from husbands without glass walls separating them. The hunger strikes, for them, were acts of desperation that had given their loved ones back. If not their freedom, at least their humanity. One woman recalled. 4 years my husband was a voice on the phone, a face behind glass. Now he can hold our daughter's hand. That's all we ever wanted. Did the gangs win? But beneath the human stories lay a darker reality. The very hunger strikes that won reforms also proved something unsettling. California's gangs were still powerful, even in solitary. The strikes had required coordination across racial and gang divides. Shot callers in the SHU had sent word through coded letters, corrupted staff, and family visits. They had mobilized tens of thousands of inmates across the state. If they could do that in isolation, what could they do now, back in general population? Law enforcement officials warned that the reforms had strengthened, not weakened, gang influence. Reports surfaced of coordinated attacks, smuggling operations, and renewed recruitment. The paradox of Pelican Bay was clear. The SHU had been inhumane, but it had also been a tool to contain criminal networks. Without it, the networks grew. The political fallout. In the years after 2015, debates raged in California's legislature. Advocates pointed to the settlement as a human rights victory. Prison unions pointed to rising violence as proof the reforms were dangerous. The question became larger than Pelican Bay. Across the U.S., states looked at California's reforms as a test case. Could prisons end indefinite solitary confinement without collapsing into chaos? Or was solitary, however cruel, a necessary evil? No easy answers came. The shadow of Billy's cell. The name Billy Guero, cell haunted the debate. His death during the 2013 strike was remembered as both tragedy and symbol. Advocates held him up as the man who paid the ultimate price for reform. Prison officials insisted his death wasn't caused by the strike. Either way, his story kept the memory of the protests alive. At rallies, his photo was carried on posters. Families chanted his name. For many, Billy's cell became the face of a movement that proved even prisoners locked in cages could change history. Pelican Bay today. By the early 2020s, Pelican Bay's SHU was largely empty. The once feared rows of windowless cells now stood as ghostly reminders of a different era. But the prison itself remained one of the most secure in America, still housing men considered among the most dangerous. It no longer symbolized absolute isolation. It symbolized resistance, reform, and the unresolved tension between security and humanity. Today, Pelican Bay is studied in criminology courses, written about in books, and featured in documentaries. It is no longer a hidden world. It is a cautionary tale. The legacy of the hunger strikes. The legacy of the hunger strikes is layered. 4 inmates. Proof that unity, even across gangs and races, could shake the system. 4 families. Proof that their voices mattered when amplified outside prison walls. For the state, a reminder that repression breeds resistance and silence can become protest. For the world, evidence that even the most secure prisons cannot erase human will. But the strikes also left a warning. California proved it could end indefinite solitary confinement. But it also proved that gangs could bend the prison system to their will, using hunger as a weapon as powerful as any shank or smuggled phone. Closing reflection. The story of Pelican Bay's hunger strikes is not just about food or about prison walls. It is about power, who has it, how it is used, and what happens when the powerless find a way to seize it back. In 2011 and 2013, men locked in the most secure cells in America turned silence into a weapon and forced the world to listen. They paid in flesh, in health, and in blood. But they changed the system forever. Yet the shadow of the SHU remains. The abandoned cells are reminders of a time when California believed isolation could kill crime. The gangs that orchestrated the strikes remain reminders that power does not disappear, it adapts. And so, Pelican Bay lives on in history as both a graveyard of silence and a birthplace of resistance.